So let's take a closer look now at bone development. Bone development is also known as osteogenesis or ossification, the process of bone tissue formation. In embryos, this leads to the formation of the bony skeleton. Then in children and young adults, the ossification occurs as part of continued bone growth. And in adults, it occurs as part of bone remodeling and bone repair. So bone development is lifelong. So let's look at the three parts again. Bone formation begins about the second month of development. After birth, we have postnatal bone growth into early adulthood, and then bone remodeling and repair is lifelong. So osteogenesis or bone tissue formation is lifelong because bone remodeling and repair continues until death. So when we're talking about bone formation, we need to start from the beginning, the formation of the bony skeleton. Because up to about week 8, the skeleton's really just fibrous membranes and hyaline cartilage. That's what we would see in the fetal skeleton, and that has to be replaced with bone tissue. There's two types of processes that replace fibrous and cartilage tissue with bone. The first is endochondral ossification, that forms bone by replacing hyaline cartilage. So bones are oftentimes called cartilage or endochondral bones, which is when they use endochondral ossification. And that's not all bones, but they do form most of the skeleton. There's other bones, however, that develop from a fibrous membrane. These bones, once they're bone, are oftentimes called membrane bones. Let's look more, though, at endochondral ossification. So it forms essentially all bones that are inferior to the base of the skull, except your clavicles, which are known as your collarbones. It begins in month 2 of development before you're born and uses previously formed hyaline cartilage models to make bone. And so that requires the breakdown of the hyaline cartilage model prior to bone formation. So that begins at the middle of the bone, at the middle of the shaft of what at first is hyaline cartilage. And this location is called the primary ossification center. One of the first things that happens after the formation of the primary ossification center is blood vessels infiltrate the perichondrium, and they convert it to a periosteum. It's still the same tissue, but once it's surrounding bone, it's not something surrounding cartilage, perichondrium. It's something surrounding bone, periosteum. So we're just changing the name. But what's also happening within the periosteum is the formation of mesenchymal cells that are specializing into osteoblasts. Because osteoblasts are going to be able to make our bone matrix. So there's 5 main steps in this process of ossification, of endochondral ossification, where we're taking hyaline cartilage and forming bone. After the formation of the primary ossification center, a bone collar will form around the diaphysis of the cartilage model, the shaft of the cartilage model. This will actually shunt blood flow from the perichondrium to the cartilage model. So the central cartilage in the diaphysis starts to die, and then it starts to calcify and develop cavities as this cartilage dies and moves away, essentially, because the debris is all that's left. In order to try to save the dying cartilage, the periosteum actually responds by creating a periosteal bud, or a blood cavity, that it sends into this cavity and tries to save all of the cartilage. But the periosteal bud brings in with it mesenchymal tissue that can form osteoblasts and nearby osteoclasts that have arrived. And so that is going to introduce cells that can create bone matrix into the center of this hyaline cartilage model. So the bud is essentially made up of blood vessels, nerves, red marrow, osteogenic cells, and osteoclasts. This periosteal bud is trying to save the day for cartilage, but actually ends up introducing everything we need to make bone. As the bone is made, the diaphysis elongates, the medullary cavity of long bones forms, and we even get sometimes secondary ossification centers that appear in one or both epiphyses. And then finally, the ends of long bones, the epiphyses, they would ossify. And the hyaline cartilage would only remain at the epiphyseal plates and articular cartilages. Epiphyseal plates are areas of bone growth, and when you stop growing, your long bones turn those epiphyseal plates into bone completely, and they become epiphyseal lines. So epiphyseal lines are just remnants of epiphyseal plates, or remnants of bone growth. Articular cartilages our hyaline cartilage that's left over at the ends of long bones, and that's going to help reduce friction between bones that rub against each other. So here is the entire process. We're starting at the beginning with a primary ossification center forming. That's in response to growth signals at about week 9 of gestation. Then a bone collar forms, and that is going to cut off nutrition from the surrounding perichondrium into the hyaline cartilage model. So the cartilage matrix starts to completely deteriorate, and that's where we're going to see the beginning of the medullary cavity. Growth signals tell the body to try to save the cartilage cells, and so they send in a periosteal bud, which is mainly a blood vessel, but we have mesenchymal tissue and red marrow and osteoblasts and osteoclasts that hitch a ride on this periosteal bud. And so instead of saving the hyaline cartilage matrix, it actually brings everything that's needed to start to ossify bone or make bone matrix instead. So that's exactly what we see. And this is a nutrition shift that happens at about month 3 of gestation because cartilage is not vascularized. It has no blood vessels. But this attempt to save the cartilage actually brings blood vessels or vascularization to bone, which is why bone has blood vessels and cartilage doesn't. As the development continues and the ossification is trying to complete, we see the diaphysis elongate, the medullary cavity in the center form, and sometimes secondary ossification centers form. They don't always form in both ends of a long bone, but they form in those ends of a long bone called epiphyses. And then finally, the epiphyses completely ossify, and all that's left over at the end when it comes to cartilage is the articular cartilage at the ends of long bone to prevent friction between bones, and at the epiphyseal plates. These are areas where cartilage remains, so growth of bone can occur, and then further ossification happens after that bone growth. When you stop growing, those epiphyseal plates turn into epiphyseal lines, and they're remnants of those plates. So that was endochondral ossification. But let's also look at intramembranous ossification. So this begins within fibrous connective tissue membranes. It's just a connective tissue membrane formed by a lot of mesenchymal cells. It forms a lot of flat bones, like those of the skull, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal bones. But it also forms the clavicle bones. When we're talking about this type of intramembranous ossification, it has 4 major steps. Ossification centers are formed when mesenchymal cells cluster and become osteoblasts. So it begins with growth signals that differentiate the stem cell into bone building cells. The bone building cells, the osteoblasts, then lay down osteoid that then gets calcified, and this woven bone formation starts to be formed. And that's when osteoid is laid down around blood vessels. And that results in the trabeculae, the spicules that we know of spongy bone. The outer layer of woven bone forms a periosteum, or a dense connective tissue, a girdle for this membranous bone. And lamellar bone usually replaces the woven bone, at least on the outside of flat bones. And we tend to see red marrow in some of these flat bones in the trabeculae, spongy bone places. That's what we're seeing here. Ossification kind of in the development in the middle of this intramembranous tissue. And the reason it's called intramembranous ossification is because the ossification center starts from the middle or within a membrane made up mainly of mesenchymal cells. That growth continues, then we get woven bone or kind of immature spongy bone around blood vessels. And then the differentiation continues so that we have a compact bone on the outside, and then that woven bone is replaced by spongy bone with its very pronounced trabeculae or spicules. And the rest of the mesenchymal tissue produces a periosteum or protective connective tissue covering for flat bones that we see on the outside of all bones, not just flat bones, but also long bones. And then we can move on to postnatal bone growth. These are when long bones grow lengthwise by interstitial or longitudinal growth of the epiphyseal plate. This is when we see bones increase in thickness through both interstitial and appositional growth. And bones stop growing during about adolescence, and some facial bones continue to grow slowly through life. So what we're seeing with postnatal bone growth is long bones growing lengthwise and getting thicker, responding to stressors and strains, and that tends to start to end during kind of the end of adolescence, and that's when we're going to start seeing, especially in long bones, the epiphyseal plates turn into epiphyseal lines. So let's look at the growth and length of long bones. Interstitial growth requires epiphyseal cartilage. That requires cartilage in the location of the epiphyseal plate. And that generally maintains kind of a constant thickness while you continue to grow. The rate of cartilage growth on one side is balanced by usually bone replacement on the other. So any growth is then generally calcified. There is a resting zone or an area of cartilage on the epiphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate that is relatively inactive. And then below that resting zone, there are 4 zones: the proliferation or growth zone, hypertrophic zone, calcification zone, and the ossification or osteogenic zone. Now, that proliferation or growth zone is an area of cartilage that's on the side of the bone shaft, the diaphysis. So it's on the bone shaft side of the epiphyseal plate, and it has rapidly dividing cells. The new cells are formed and move upward, and that pushes the end of the long bone or the epiphyses away from the diaphysis, and that's going to result in lengthening. Then the hypertrophic zone is an area where older chondrocytes closer to the diaphysis are located, and the cartilage cells in the lacunae there enlarge and erode, forming more interconnecting spaces than what we think of as normal cartilage matrix. Then we have the calcification zone. This is an area surrounding cartilage matrix that is calcifying. This is where the chondrocytes are starting to die and deteriorate, and then they move into the ossification zone, where the chondrocyte deterioration continues, but is leaving long spicules as a result. And we're starting to see calcified cartilage at kind of the epiphyses diaphysis junction or into the long bone next to the shaft junction. Spicules are then created by erosion thanks to osteoclasts, and then they're covered with new bone by osteoblasts. So this is ultimately replaced with spongy bone. We also will see the medullary cavity enlarge as these spicules are eroded, so the medullary cavity grows along with bone lengthening. So here we're taking a look at those zones, at essentially bone lengthening that occurs at the epiphyseal plate, thanks to the remnant of hyaline cartilage left over from endochondral ossification. So you see up at the top we have the resting zone. Down below we have the proliferation zone, where cartilage cells undergo mitosis. Then they can move into the hypertrophic zone, where they're getting a little far from that proliferation zone and kind of continued production of cells. And they're older cartilage cells at this point, and they're starting to enlarge. And then they start to die as they move into the calcification zone. This is where cartilage cells die, and the matrix that we consider cartilage begins deteriorating. Then as they move into the ossification zone, we see new bone starting to form. This is all thanks to osteoblasts and osteoclasts and growth signals that remain present in this area during the length of time that an individual grows, especially where we need to see lengthening of bone, not just lengthening of essentially more matrix based on stresses and strains. So near the end of adolescence, the chondroblasts are not dividing as often in that proliferation zone. The epiphyseal plate will get much thinner until it's eventually completely replaced by bone, and that's called epiphyseal plate closure. And that occurs when the epiphyses and the diaphysis fuse together with just bone. And that means bone lengthening has ceased. For females, that occurs about age 18. And for males, that's about age 21. Now, growth in width or thickness, that is known as appositional growth. And that can occur throughout life. It doesn't end like increased length or interstitial growth does. So bones thicken in response to increased stress from muscle activity or added weight if you picked up a new sport. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum can still secrete bone matrix on external bone for your entire life. Osteoclasts can also work for your entire life, removing bone on the endosteal surface. So usually there's more building up than breaking down when we're talking about bone development that is postnatal and is talking about appositional growth. that usually leads to stronger, thicker bone that's not too heavy. So just because the bone's getting thicker doesn't mean it won't be remodeled, so that it still maintains the same weight roughly. So here you can see an image where you have before growth and remodeling on the left and after growth and remodeling on the right. So in order for the bone to get longer, that's interstitial growth, and that growth occurs at the epiphyseal plate. And that growth will cease when the epiphyseal plate closes, usually near the end of adolescence. But then growth in width, that is possible because of appositional growth, and that can continue for your entire life because that's a part of kind of natural bone remodeling or natural response to stresses and strains you put on the bone. All right, next we're going to be looking at hormonal regulation of bone growth. So we're going to be looking a little bit more at bone remodeling, but how we use hormones in order to kind of route what happens when it comes to bone remodeling. So make sure to watch that video.